For what purpose does the gentleman from Pennsylvania seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I move that the House suspend the rules and concur with the Senate amendment to H.R. 623 as amended by the Senate.
The clerk will report the title of the bill.
H.R. 623, an act to amend the Homeland Security Act of 2002 to authorize the Department of Homeland Security to establish a social media working group and for other purposes. Senate amendment.
Pursuant to the rule, the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Costello, and the gentleman from Indiana, Mr. Carson, each will control 20 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Pennsylvania.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that all members may have 5 legislative days in which to revise and extend their remarks and include extraneous material on H.R. 623 as amended.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield myself such time as I may consume.
The gentleman is recognized.
As disasters become more frequent and severe, it is critical that emergency managers and citizens take advantage of new technologies to send and receive critical information. Social media has become an essential tool in the preparedness, response, and recovery for all hazards, whether natural or man-made. We saw how critical social media was in relaying information following Hurricane Sandy, the Boston Marathon bombing, and just a few weeks ago during Hurricane Joaquin and the historic flooding in South Carolina. Social media helps reach people in need, helps get the right information into the hands of the public, helps organize volunteers, and can be a source of critical on-the-ground information to decision makers. H.R. 623, as amended by the Senate, would require DHS to establish a social media working group to enhance the use of social media to support preparedness, response, and recovery of all hazards. This group will be required to report to Congress on an annual basis on its findings, emerging trends, and best practices. I commend the gentlewoman from Indiana for sponsoring this legislation. Thank you, and I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Indiana is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. H.R. 623, the DHS Social Media Improvement Act of 2015, was introduced by my good friend and colleague from Indiana, Congresswoman Susan Brooks. The bill, Mr. Speaker, was referred to the Committee on Transportation and Infrastructure and to the Committee on Homeland Security. This bill codifies the Department of Homeland Security's social media working group to enhance the use of social media during disasters and other events, and to provide guidance and best practices in emergency preparedness and response. Social media, especially Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube, can play a critical role in preparedness, response, and recovery operations during emergencies. Emergency managers at all levels use social media to warn those in harm's way of impending natural hazards. Social media is also used to inform survivors on how to access disaster assistance and tips for speedier recoveries. Equally important, Mr. Speaker, social media has been used to coordinate and manage assistance from nonprofits and volunteers who want to help in recovery efforts. More and more, we are seeing individuals take to social media during emergencies. Individuals have used social media to help identify locations where assistance may still be needed and to raise awareness of impending hazards. They have also used it, Mr. Speaker, to communicate with loved ones who may be impacted by an event, as well as reconnect pets with their owners. This has certainly been the case in the great Hoosier State. This last summer, Mr. Speaker, will go down as the wettest summer in Indianapolis' history. Rainfall in July broke a 140-year-old record in our great city, making it the wettest month ever recorded. And social media has helped keep residents informed in real time. In Indianapolis, the National Weather Service, Department of Homeland Security, and local broadcasters routinely use social media to post updates on ever-changing weather conditions. The very unique benefit of social media alerts is that you don't have to be right next to a radio or TV to be informed. You can virtually be anywhere. This summer, when dangerous flooding covered many roads in our city, social media exploded with pictures of flooded roadways and stranded motorists. This non-traditional tool enabled people to know where major problems were located and to avoid danger with the famous catchphrase, "Turn around, don't drown." The existing DHS Social Media Working Group provides recommendations on how to use social media before, during and after emergencies. This working group, Mr. Speaker, consists of emergency responders, NGOs, nonprofits, and federal agencies. I support the provision in today's bill to broaden the group's membership to include private sector representatives and to require consultation with non-members. To ensure accountability, this bill requires an annual report to Congress on important issues such as best practices and lessons learned. It would also provide recommendations on how to improve the use of the social media platform for emergency management purposes. And finally, Mr. Speaker, we recognize the importance of this platform for emergency management. I would be remiss not to remind our colleagues the need to authorize the Integrated Public Alert and Warning System, also known as IPAWS, as the committee of primary jurisdiction over IPAWS. The Transportation and Infrastructure Committee unanimously approved the Barletta-Carson IPAWS authorization bill back in April and ordered the bill reported. It is past time for this bill to be considered in the House. Despite the Senate's inadvertent omission of the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee, I support this bill, Mr. Speaker, and we urge our colleagues to do the same to approve this measure. I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Pennsylvania is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I wish to yield 5 minutes to the sponsor of this bill, the gentlewoman from Indiana, Ms. Brooks.
The gentlewoman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today in support of H.R. 623, the DHS Social Media Improvement Act of 2015. I want to thank the gentleman from Pennsylvania for his management of the bill, and also my good friend and colleague from the state of Indiana, Congressman Carson. Both of us have served in public safety in the past, and so it is especially gratifying that he is managing the bill as well this evening. Social media, as we've heard, is transforming the way the nation is communicating before, during, and after terrorist attacks, natural disasters, and other emergencies. There are countless examples from recent events of how citizens are turning to Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and even Snapchat for public safety information to comfort survivors, tell loved ones they're safe, and request assistance. And has already been mentioned, citizens of South Carolina use social media to communicate with first responders, friends, and families after heavy rainfall caused destructive flash flooding across the state. And additionally, a quarter of Americans, let me repeat, a quarter of Americans got information about the devastating terrorist attack at the 2013 Boston Marathon bombing from Facebook and Twitter. Citizens are not the only ones using social media during and after an emergency. First responders are proactively using social media as a force multiplier to get vital information out. For example, immediately following the terrorist attack and during the manhunt, the Boston PD utilized social media as a way to communicate with and solicit information from citizens and visitors. These are just a few of the hundreds of examples that demonstrate the prevalence of social media use before, during, and after an emergency. In the 113th Congress, I served as the chair of the Committee on Homeland Security's Subcommittee on Emergency Preparedness, Response, and Communications. And the subcommittee held 2 hearings that focused on this new phenomenon, and I learned at that time that the nation is making great strides in this area. Gaps and challenges remain. One of the key takeaways, however, was that during and after a terrorist attack, natural disaster, or other emergency, there is still a need for better communication between the public and the private sectors, specifically with how to utilize social media as a communications tool. And so last year I was proud to work with the ranking member, Congressman Payne, to find ways to better utilize social media during disasters by leveraging both public and private resources and experiences. So the bill passed with overwhelming support last Congress, and after reintroduction this Congress, I'm pleased to say in February, the House again resoundingly agreed to its passage. So H.R. 623, essentially, while authorizing and enhancing the Department of Homeland Security existing social media group, what it does, however, it ensures that best practices and lessons learned on the use of social media during terrorist attacks or disasters are being discussed and shared with federal, state, and local first responders, non-governmental organizations, academia, and the private sector. Currently, the virtual social media working group is made up primarily of state and local officials, and they are doing great work in developing guidance. But however, this bill will increase the group's stakeholder participation, particularly among the private sector and the federal response agencies. And so by including private sector groups like Google and Twitter and Facebook, we know it will improve coordination and relief efforts. It also, as we've already heard, it will require the group to submit an annual report to Congress highlighting best practices, lessons learned, and any recommendations. And finally, this bill will require the group to meet in person or virtually at least twice a year and will not be a financial burden on the department. So I appreciate the swift action of the Senate Homeland Security and Governmental Affairs Committee. I especially want to thank Chairman Johnson for his leadership on this issue. Their thoughtful additions have served to further improve the bill. I also want to thank Chairman Schuster and Chairman Barletta of the T&I Committee for working with me to get this bill to the floor, and also my successor at EPRC, Ms. McSally, for continuing to make this issue a priority. And finally, I want to thank the staff, because we know that this bill and the improvements with technology, it will save lives and will make our first responders and those in danger safer. With that, I yield back and urge my colleagues to support the bill.
The gentlewoman yields back. The gentleman from Pennsylvania is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, may I inquire if the gentleman from Indiana has yielded back all his time?
The gentleman has yielded back.
Speakers, at this time, I yield back, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, I yield back the balance of my time as well.
The gentleman yields back. The question is, will the House suspend the rules and concur in the House amendment to H.R. 623? Those in favor will say aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, 2/3 being in the affirmative, the rules are suspended. The Senate amendment is agreed to, and without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table.